Now this is one of the neater features. In PowerShell version 2, it was pretty much overlooked. It got a little easier to use in PowerShell version 3, and I think more people are starting to pay attention to it. Basically, I'm going to show you how to start a session on a remote machine and ask that session to load one of its local modules into its memory, but then bring over a copy, shortcuts of that module's commands onto your computer. It's not exactly the same as installing those commands on your computer because they continue to execute on the remote machine. The entire concept is called implicit remoting, and it is a very cool set of features with some gotchas and some caveats around it, which I'm also going to cover. Now, as we get started, I want to kind of briefly remind you what's going on here. I am working either on this computer or this computer, both of which are in the lab.pri domain. My domain controller's name is DC. That's going to become important in the demo I'm about to do. There is a trust between my forest and this forest, which is called remote.pri, and which contains a computer called RDC, remote DC. This guy's not involved right now, so we're not going to play with him at all. Okay, so just keep that in mind for a second. So over here on Windows 7, I'm going to just briefly kind of demonstrate that I'm able to get to both of those computers. So I am a member of the lab.pri domain, okay? So I should be able to enter ps session, specify the computer name, dc.lab.pri. I'm already signed onto my computer as an administrator in this domain, and I'm running PowerShell as that user. So I'm not going to pass along any other credential. And I was able to successfully get in. So let's exit that. Now I want to show you, enter ps session, computer name, rdc.remote.pri. That's the other domain. Now, frankly, I'm not entirely positive that my current user account has any kind of privileges or permissions in that remote domain, so I'm going to specify a different credential. I'm going to use an administrator from that domain, and I'm going to be prompted for his password. And because there's a trust relationship between our domains, it's able to, via the Kerberos protocol, do all the mutual authentication and everything else. And you can see now from my prompt that I am in rdc.remote.pri. Okay? Both of those remote domain controllers are running Windows Server 2012. Now, Windows Server 2012 shipped with PowerShell version 3, and it also shipped with its own set of Active Directory commands. Those commands are installed on every domain controller. So both of those machines have their own Active Directory domain commands. Now, those same Active Directory commands can be installed on Windows 8 because it's like the same version of Windows as Windows Server 2012. You would get those commands in the Remote Server Administration Toolkit. In fact, the Windows 8 computer that you've seen me using in other demonstrations in this series has those Active Directory commands. That's why I'm deliberately doing this demo on this Windows 7 computer. I don't have any modules loaded into memory. And if you list the modules that are installed on this computer, there's very clearly not an Active Directory module. I don't have any commands on this computer whose noun begins with AD, like get AD user or new AD user. Here's what I'm going to do instead. DC equals new ps session, computer name, dc.lab.pri. So I'm now establishing a permanent session or a persistent session to my domain's domain controller. And now I've established a persistent session on the remote domain's domain controller, and I've used the same connection credential and everything else. If I run get ps session, you can see that I have both of those opened and available. Now here's the fun thing. I'm going to invoke a command, and I'm going to do it on both of those sessions, DC and RDC. The command I'm going to invoke is import module Active Directory. So I'm asking those remote copies of PowerShell to load their Active Directory commands into memory. And you even got to see the little status bar pop up as they did it. Import PS session. I'm going to start with my local session. Oops, got to spell this right. I'm asking the session on my domain's domain controller to send me a copy of its Active Directory module. And I'm asking it, when it does that, to add the prefix lab to those commands nouns. Just as a way to help me keep track of the fact that those commands are running on the lab domain. Now, this is not actually installing those commands on my computer. It's creating, I guess you could think of them as shortcuts. The commands kind of exist on my computer, but what exists on my computer is just a shell. If I try to run those commands, it's actually going to execute the command on the remote computer, and the results are going to come back to me. Here's an example. Get, and you'll notice if I type ADUser and try that tab complete, nothing happens, and that's because I asked it to add that lab prefix. So that actually ran on the remote machine, and those results came back to me via remoting. It is functionally the same as if I had said invoke command, oops, script block, get ADUser minus filter star on the session DC. Functionally the same. The reason I didn't have to put the lab here is because this entire command is just being sent to the remote computer. When I run this, there actually is a sort of shell command. It's called a proxy on my computer with this name. Inside that proxy, it is implicitly remoting the get ADUser command on the remote computer. So let's do this import PS session one more time. This time I'm going to import the RDC's Active Directory module and use a different prefix. So now I can actually run get remote ADUser minus filter star, and I can run get lab ADUser minus filter star. In each case, the command is being sent off to the respective domain controller running locally in that domain using the credentials that I used to spin up those sessions in the first place. If I run get PS session, you can see that both of those sessions are still up and available. If I close those sessions, get lab AD, no more tab completion, the session is no longer there, and so my local fake out shortcut commands are gone. This is an incredible, very powerful technique. It is called implicit remoting. And you can kind of think about it this way. I'll actually show you a scenario I did once with a customer. They had Exchange 2007, which has lots of PowerShell commands, and they were moving to Exchange 2010 at the time. And so their administrators could sit over here and bring in both sets of commands. They would just prefix them with -2007 whatever, so get -2007 mailbox or get 2010. When they ran the commands, they knew that the command was actually running in the appropriate version of Exchange with the results coming back. You see, if they had just installed the administrative tools locally, they would have had to pick either this or this. You can't have them both running side by side easily. But by leaving the commands out on the actual computers, on the actual servers, they were able to bring all the commands and kind of mix and match them on their computer because none of the commands exist there. They were simply being implicitly remoted. Now that said, there's a few caveats about this. Let me spin up one of those sessions again so I can show you. I'll just connect it to my domain controller here. And now I want to import those. So now I should be able to run get lab ADUser minus filter star. And the fact that it's tab completing tells me that it's going to work. But let's pipe that to get member. Whoopsie. This is a deserialized Microsoft.ActiveDirectory.management.ADUser. And the difference is this means this object was produced on the remote computer, serialized or encoded into XML. The XML was transmitted across the network, it was received by my computer, and deserialized back into an object. The primary difference between a deserialized object and the original one is that the deserialized object won't have any of the unique methods. And the only method you'll usually see is toString, because that's a method of all objects in the .NET framework. I won't, in other words, be able to do anything to this user. I won't be able to make changes by changing properties. I won't be able to call any methods of this object. Now, sometimes that can get a little bit dangerous. Let's say, for example, that I wanted to get EX mailbox because I had imported the get mailbox command from an Exchange server and then pipe it to set EX mailbox. If this second command is depending upon receiving objects from this command, and it's depending on those objects still having their methods, then this approach would fail. And in fact, a lot of the times, particularly with some of the first products that were PowerShellified, like Exchange Server, you will run into problems using their commands through implicit remoting, because they just weren't designed for it. I'm actually kind of curious as to how the AD user command will work. Let's change this so that I can just do the identity donj. Let's see if I get a user from that. I did. Okay, now let's pipe it to set AD user. Sorry, set lab AD user. That's a lot of tabbing. There it is. Let's set his department to technology and his city to, where do I want to move? How about LA? The input object cannot be bound to any parameters for the command, either because the command doesn't take pipeline input or because the input and its properties don't match anything. In other words, normally on a remote machine I could do this. And in fact, I want to prove that to you. Enter PS session, and I'll enter my DC session that's up and running. Let's try and run that same command again. Now, because I'm on the remote computer, I'm going to be using the original AD user names. It worked fine. That's because set AD user is expecting objects of the type AD user, which get AD user produces. What happened here is I ran this, it was implicitly remoted, the remote machine ran it, translated the results into XML, brought them back to my computer, deserialized them into objects, and then put them into my local pipeline. Those were then transmitted to here. Well, it's perfectly happy to take AD user objects, but it seems it's not so happy about taking deserialized AD objects. So kind of the practical moral of this story is that implicit remoting is great for running one command, and in some cases it'll support pipelines. But in many cases, the fact that you're dealing with deserialized objects prevents it from working entirely. Now when that happens, it's okay. You've got fallback positions. For example, I could have done an enter PS session and come over and done exactly what I did here, and it works fine. Let's exit that. I could also invoke command and say, hey, on that session that I already have up and running, I just want you to run this. I'm going to copy that to the clipboard, paste it in just to save myself a little typing. Maybe I'm not going to paste it in. It doesn't seem to want to paste in. Whoa! Okay, clearly I have ticked off PowerShell. Let's try it again. Let's start up my session, DC equals enter PS session, computer name, dc.lab.pri. Okay, good, that worked. And I wanted to do a new PS session, not an exit, so let's pull that back up. So in addition to entering the PS session, I could say invoke command on the session in DC, and the command to invoke is get AD user minus identity donj pipe to set AD user minus department tech. We'll keep it short. And that'll work just fine. So, you know, there's another upshot here too. Let's say I had imported this. Import PS session. Import PS session from the session in DC. Let's put the prefix lab, and let's only grab the Active Directory module. And can we do get lab AD user minus filter star? Good. Now I said I can't then go on to set, but here's a trick. Sometimes you don't need the pipeline. Set AD user, lab AD user, identity. I can put the identity here. I can specify Don J, change his department back to IT. There's no need for me to do a get and then pipe to a set in this particular instance. So anyway, the upshot is that while implicit remoting is really, really nice, expect it to not be 1 bazillion% functional. Some things just don't work with it. I've run across a couple of instances. I'll mention another one here just so that you kind of have an idea. Let's do a help on set lab AD user. This is a neat thing. It's actually got the help too. So it's going over to the remote machine, getting the help, and that's why it took it just a second to pull it over. Anyway, on set AD user, you'll notice that there, and it shows you the real command name here without the prefix I added. You'll notice that you've got all these parameters for description and department and so forth. That covers most of the commonly used properties in Active Directory, but it doesn't include all of the properties supported by Active Directory. There's another parameter in here somewhere. I guess it's actually a set. You can specify properties to remove, properties to replace, and you do that by passing a hash table. That's the little @ sign with the curly bracket thing. There's also an add to add new ones. My experience has been those hash tables don't get correctly done up. So you can't really use those particular parameters through implicit remoting, at least not in the current version of the product. You know, it's something people mention, and I'm sure someone at Microsoft goes, dope, facepalm, and then they get it fixed in a later release at some point. I wanted you to just be aware that it's not all, you know, roses and unicorns here. There's some places where it doesn't work, but the implicit remoting is still a very cool thing. Now, talking about PowerShell version 3 here on my Windows 8 computer, everything I just told you is all still true. The only difference is they made it a little bit easier for you to do that implicit remoting stuff. I still have to start with a session. Only now, I don't have to tell the remote computer to import whatever module I want into memory, and I don't have to do an import PS session. Instead, get module, PS session DC, list available. Show me what modules are on that remote computer. Takes it a second because it has to go look. Oh, wow, there's a lot. Okay, import module. Name, I don't know, net adapter. Doesn't really matter, I guess. From the PS session DC. So in one step, this is going to go out to that session I've already got running. It's going to load up the net adapter module into memory, and then it's going to create those proxy shortcut functions on my computer. I can even specify a prefix like this. I'll put DC. Failed to generate the proxies. Files cannot be loaded because the running of scripts is disabled on this system. Ha! That's an awesome error. I'm glad we got that. I have got my computer configured to not allow script execution, which is actually the default for Windows PowerShell version 3. We're going to talk a lot about the security later, but it's probably a good idea if I want to do this demo for us to set it. So let's set this to remote signed, which is for right now a good safe place to be. And we'll try and reload that remote module. See, those little proxy shortcut functions are actually in a script that it dynamically just created. So now if I run get module to see what's in my memory, I've got this net adapter script module that's actually pointing to a different computer. So I loaded those with a prefix, right? So instead of get net adapter, it's get DC net adapter. But I want to show you something. Import module, net adapter, get module. I got two. I have the net adapter that lives on my computer because Windows 8 has that same module. So I can run get net adapter. Those are my local adapters, and I can run get DC net adapter. And those are the adapters on that remote computer. If I do the first command and pipe it to GM, you can see that this produces objects of the type blah, 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 all that. If I do get DC net adapter and pipe it to GM, it's the same thing, but it's just been deserialized. Now in this case, because it's a sim object, I actually get a lot of good stuff out of it still. You can probably use this for a lot of cool things. But again, this ability to implicitly remote commands from a remote computer is a very cool thing. What it means in the long term, maybe not now because not every command works perfectly, but in the long term, you don't need to install the administrative tools on your local computer. You can just consume those commands from a server. And the other neat thing, take the example I just did with Active Directory. I don't know if you're aware of it, but a domain controller has a really high-speed connection to the domain. Well, because it's local on the machine, right? So instead of my computer having to process all that, why not let the domain controller process it? It's the domain controller. Technically, it's going to do all the processing anyway, and then just let it send the results back to me. So it actually can become a more efficient way of administering, too. So that's implicit remoting syntax differences for PowerShell version 3. So there you have it. The basic steps: start up a session, ask that remote session to load one of its modules into its memory, and then create shortcuts to that module's commands on your computer. Add a prefix if you want to help you remember what computer the command came from, and you can mix and match commands from all kinds of different computers in your environment into a single session without ever installing those things locally. Now, there are obviously some caveats and gotchas. Not everything works exactly perfectly every single time, but this is just one set of great tools in your tool belt. You've obviously got others, and in the upcoming nuggets, we're going to cover even more ways that you can use remoting. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you.